Welcome to episode 5 of Monolith Motors. This is a 1970 Torino Cobra jet. This is somewhat similar to my very first car. I had a 1970 Torino, but it was a 4-door, and it was only a 302 cubic inch engine with a 2-barrel carb. This is much nicer. This was originally a 429 J code, which means it has a shaker hood, so it's a pretty desirable car. This one's been converted to drag racing. So that is a 460 cubic inch engine, and it's got a high stall torque converter, spool rear end, and this super cool tunnel ram. I put the scoop on it though. I think that looks killer. So here's a quick walk around, and then I'll go through some of the history of what I did to it. I put some Jeep wheels on it. They're spaced out about an inch because the offsets are different, but looks about right. These are 225/75 R15 tires in the front. Went a little smaller so I didn't have to cut anything. You can see though the fenders aren't really that great. There's a little bit of rust around there, and this is a really weird spot for rust, but it's got some rust up on the top of the fender. In the rear you can see this has been cut out previously, and then there's some rust all around the edges, but it's big enough to fit some 31 by 10.5 tires on it, so those look pretty cool. Again, the Jeep wheels and spaced out a bit. This is the fuel cell that came in the car. It's all pretty solid back here. You can see the roll cage, how that ties in on either side. I put a new battery in it. This side of the car, the passenger side, is kind of rough. It's got evidence here of quite a bit of Bondo that's cracking, and so it was obviously hit on this side, and you can really tell that when you go in on to the inside. Everything in here is the original grabber green color, except for this passenger door, which is a lighter metallic green. You can see there's some surface rust in the floor, some evidence of some previous patch panels, but you know, generally it's pretty solid. There are some dents up from underneath, so something happened to that in the past. Here you can see the roll cage. There's a bit of a firewall to the back. This is the seat that I put in it. Her shifter. There's the Msd water temp gauge, oil pressure gauge. There's a tachometer and fuel pressure gauge is outside. These are the switches to turn on the fuel and ignition and fans and things. And the starter button. So under here you can see the Ford 9-inch rear end. That's not stock, that's a heavy duty part right off a truck. And then there's the fuel pump and the fuel sump of the fuel cell. There is some rust though. You can see where the rear spring hangers are. This is the passenger side. You can see there's some rust coming through right there. And on the driver's side it's even worse near this spring hanger. It's actually big section of that frame is gone. Moving forward, you can see the ladder bars and how they're mounted in. This is a piece of box section that's been welded to stiffen the unibody, and that goes all the way forward to about there. And then there's a piece of angle iron that takes over that's sandwiched into it. But you can see the floor is not too bad rust wise. That's the plate for the roll cage right there, bolted on. So coming in behind the front wheels, you can see there's a section of this box member that the bottom's just missing, rusted away. And you can see this is again the additional reinforcements that were welded on to strengthen things. Up front, right behind the oil pan, there's a steel box section that's been welded in. And you can see up under here there's some rust spots here and there, and some pieces like this area that have been rusted away. And then a lot of the sheet metal ahead of the radiator has been cut off to lighten it up. So there's no structure to mount the bumpers or anything. After I get the car cleaned up, I'm going to switch the wheels and tires from this worn out drag race setup to this set of off-road wheels. These are from Jeep, so it's the same bolt pattern as a Ford. Car's looking good after a cleanup. I did get these Jeep wheels and tires on. Looks like they fit pretty well. Just a little trimming maybe needed to the fender, but they are in a little too far, so I'm going to need to get some wheel spacers. Plenty of clearance for the tire at the rear, but again, just going to need a wheel spacer to move it out. It's sitting back a little too far. Well, I tested the brakes yesterday and the front calipers stuck on, so in order to push the car back in the garage, I'm going to have to take these off. Luckily the bolts are pretty free. Alright, so to get the engine running, I need to do a few things. One of the main things I'm trying to do is get the coil and ignition wired up. And I found all this wiring here. For the 6AL, this is an Msd 6AL ignition box that's actually was mounted on the passenger floor. I'm going to mount that in a different location so I can actually have a passenger have somewhere to put their feet. And I figured out which wires go to the coil. These were actually wired to 2 red wires, which is pretty confusing, so I'm going to do this all the way up to the coil in black and yellow. Alright, so this Msd Ignition Module was mounted to the floor here. When I took it off, all the mounts broke. So these are little rubber isolators. I got 4 more of these. And I actually want to relocate this. I'm thinking up here on the transmission tunnel would be a better location. I'm going to clean up all this wiring under here and rewire power to these switches up here on the dash so I can flip the ignition on there. Also, the transmission tunnel is pretty gnarly here. It looks like somebody used a tin snips to open it up. So I want to clean this up. But there is like a philosophy, you know. There's an internet show called Roadkill, and they're just like, you know, don't worry about making your junk perfect. Just get the damn thing running, you know? Just get it running, get it on the road.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to see, Bob.
Enjoy it, you know?
I'd like to see it out of the garage and running.
Yeah, that's what I want. Doing burnouts. Since we talked last time, I redid all the wiring here. So I mounted the MSD to the trans tunnel, reran all the hot leads back to the starter motor, and I wired up this panel so the ignition now turns on with that first switch. So I verified it, I cranked it over and I verified I'm getting spark on all of the cylinders. Coils wired up, distributors wired up, it's all good to go. So I don't have a fuel system hooked up from the tank to here, so I'm just going to fill the float bowls of the carburetors. Turn the ignition on. So today's a big day. We're going to get the Torino on the road. This will be the first time the Torino is actually driven under its own power in probably 15 years, so very excited. Here's what I did to get it going. I put a new master cylinder on, also new calipers in the front and brake cylinders in the back, bled that all out. The carbs are all rebuilt. I got some air cleaners on there. Put new spark plugs in it and new headers. The old headers were rusted apart. and the fuel pressure regulator was bad, so I replaced that. I got a new hard fuel line from the fuel cell up to this. This is just some temporary hoses to get the fuel up to the carbs. I'm still running the electric water pump. I'm eventually going to switch that out to a mechanical pump and put a proper accessory drive on, but for now that's good enough. And I bought a new radiator and I put that in. And I painted it black so it wouldn't be all nice and shiny. And then on this side I had to wire up the coil, and I needed a new high tension wire. This is eventually going to have to move when I get the alternator and accessory drive on here. Okay, so in the interior I did a bunch of work, a lot of wiring. So I got the Msd 6AL wired up here. It's a little bus bar for all the ground wires. A neutral safety switch wired into the starter motor. That works off this button. Got the ignition on one switch, fuel pump on another. That's the electric water pump. And that's the fan up front. And the shifter was all gummed up, but I just lubricated it and got it working. This is a ratchet shifter. I also mounted up this seat. It's kind of temporarily in there. I'm going to try to get it mounted back a little further. The floors are kind of Swiss cheese from, this is actually my second attempt, but there were a bunch of holes in there before. You can see the floor is kind of beat up. Anyway, so I got the seat mounted and then these cool racing belts. So it's a 5-point harness. So it should be nice and safe for the test run. So I'm ready to install the water pump and alternator and accessory drive on the front of the engine. I got everything cleaned off. This is the ground wire for the alternator, and these are all the parts. Got the water pump over here and the gaskets. That's the water pump pulley, and then crankshaft pulley, and all the brackets to mount the alternator pulley, fan. And I made up this cable, 4-gauge cable, and that'll go from the alternator output to the positive side of the starter relay, and then it'll charge the battery from there. So that's should be everything I need to put this together. So the accessory drive's all put together with a belt on it. Looks like that should work well. I got the radiator back in, all the radiator hoses. Doesn't look like it's leaking. Temporarily stuck the coil over there, but I'm going to make a nicer bracket and put it over on the driver's side cylinder head. And then the fuel lines are all complete. I did them in braided line. There's a T and a fuel filter here on a bracket, and then a flex line coming back to the fuel pressure regulator on the shock tower. In back I'm running a Holley blue fuel pump, but it's super noisy, so I'm going to replace that with this Carter pump. I've been told these run quieter, so we'll give that a shot. I've already got all this plumbed up, so this is a fuel filter, again A&8 fittings, all the way back to the fuel cell here. So what do you think of the Torino Cobra? It's got a big block.
Finally.